What's going on, you guys? It's your Huggable Hipster here, a very cozy Huggable Hipster. It's really cold outside, actually, but I'm very, very happy that it's cold because I can't stand the heat, and I'm very happy that it's winter. But for today's Psychologically Gaming, we're going to do something a little bit different, and depending on how it goes over with you guys, I'm thinking of continuing this for a little bit of time because it's really shocking to me how many people don't really understand the basics of psychology, and it's fascinating because so many people are like, oh, it's so difficult, like, you know, it's so complex. And even when I was going to school for that specifically, people are like, how do you do it? It's so complex. Like, how do the psych majors really understand a lot of the stuff that's going on in the brain? I don't even know. There's a lot there. There's a lot to really grasp and understand. You have Freud. You have so many people who we were learning about, and we were learning their methods, and we were really learning the methods behind their madness and really understanding how they taught different things. So I'm gonna do kind of like an intro to Psych 101, Professor Hipster here, okay? And we're gonna take it a step at a time, and today is gonna be rather an intro to psychology, and we're gonna be talking about the id, the ego, and the superego. So I have multiple articles and multiple references that I'm going to be citing down the description below so you guys can educate yourself further, which I would recommend, okay? Don't just listen to this video and be like, oh yeah, my training is done for today. No, I actually really want you guys to go out of your way to learn something new while it's still 2020. While it's still the year of crazy, okay, even though we're going to be going into a different year altogether, I still want you guys bettering yourselves. I still want you guys educating yourselves more on different topics that you normally would. So in one of the articles that I collected, it states in a quote that according to Freud's theory, certain aspects of your personality are more primal and might pressure you to act upon your most basic urges. Other parts of your personality work to counteract these urges and strive to make you conform to the demands of reality. Oh, that pesky thing called reality. So first we're going to look at the id. The id, according to Freud, this is a source of all psychic energy. Freud was a little interesting, making this the primary component of the personality, which actually is very fascinating because the id is the only component of the personality that is present from birth. Now, this part of the behavior, this aspect rather, is completely primitive, okay? It's completely subconscious, and it's the most basic kind of instinctual thing that a human has. The id is driven by the pleasure principle, and it strives for immediate satisfaction. So you're walking into Sephora. I'll just use this as a random example. You're walking into Sephora and you see that perfume that might cost over $100, and your first instinct is like, I want to get that. But then something else comes into your mind that we're going to discuss in a little bit that says, well, maybe you should just save your money and get that when you can afford it. It's kind of like, to use a more simpler example, imagine telling a baby to wait until their next meal time. They can't do it. It's part of their primal instinct because they want food and they want it now. Now, however, a lot of the time, meeting or trying to satiate those needs for the id is never realistic, I would say, because the id goes off of such an animalistic, primal, just I want it now thing that real life, real circumstances won't allow for that. So the ego is actually really interesting. It's the next thing that we're going to go into, and it kind of makes it so that the id's needs are being met, but in a way that is acceptable to society. The ego also functions in the conscious, unconscious, and preconscious mind, which we can get into in another video entirely. The unconscious, preconscious, and conscious mind was another thing that Freud had discussed. And you guys are going to love this. The ego is the thing that is responsible in your mind for dealing with reality. So whenever you have to make harsh decisions, when you're at the hospital with your loved ones, dealing with something really major, or dealing with anything, honestly, that has to do with reality, it's the ego discussing it for you, or part of your mind. I don't want to like completely personify the ego as its own thing because it's not. It's part of the presence of your entire brain. But, you know, for the case of this video, I think we might have to make it its own entity for right now. So think of the ego as part of your brain, but for the discussion, we're going to make it its own little thing. The id is like this thing that's kind of incapable of doing things on its own without direction. It just, think of whenever in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, think of frenzy mode. That is what the id is. That is something that goes basically to just satiate that hunger, satiate that thirst in a way. But the ego is there to be like reining it in a bit and be like, no, well, let's think about this for a second, bud, okay? Now, next up is the superego. The superego I find absolutely fascinating because this starts to develop around the age of 5, and it is encompassed and starts to mold around the ideals of society and how you were raised by your parents. Basically, it's that sense of right and wrong and knowing and differentiating between the two and understanding and really having that moral compass, if you will. It states here so you guys get like an accurate representation of what it actually is for the conscious and the ego ideal, of where the conscious includes information about things that are viewed as bad by parents and society. These behaviors are often forbidden and lead to consequences, punishment, feeling guilt, remorse. So, you know, if you kill someone, you go to jail, or if you take a cookie from the cookie jar, you get a timeout. And the ego ideal is including the rules and standards for behavior that the ego aspires to. So let's say, for example, you see a popular girl in high school, right? You want to be just like that popular girl. You're 13, 14 years old, you're premature, you're getting into more of a mindset of how you want to mold who you are around society and what you want to be. So you see those things, you see them as ideals and you see them as standards almost. So that's how you try to mold yourself. So what happens if there's an imbalance? What happens if one is over functioning the other, one is overshadowing the other? What happens if like the person has more of an ego? What happens if a person what has more of an id than an ego or a superego? There's a lot of things that can happen wrong here in the brain. Think of the person as a computer, for example. If the ego can moderate accurately between the id and the superego, you have a healthy, full functioning person. Basically, you have a normal human being. Freud actually believed that an imbalance in these parts of the personality led to a male adaptive person. Now, this is an example from the article that I got. I think this really sums it up really well, where it states here that an individual with an overly dominant id may become impulsive, uncontrollable, or even criminal, such as an individual acts upon their most basic urges with no concern for whether their behavior is appropriate or acceptable or legal. This is where we get into the realm of narcissism. This is where we get into the realm of different sociopathic tendencies. Now, someone who has a male adaptive personality is someone who might be a sociopath, someone who puts their needs before someone else. And you see someone in the case who has narcissism as well. They put their needs before someone else. And there are different grades of narcissism. There's different grades of someone who has sociopathic tendencies. And we can get into that, like I said, in another video. But there's so many different imbalances that can actually happen within the person's id, ego, and superego. I remember actually going into a comparison of the id, ego, and superego in Resident Evil, where the id is the Umbrella Chronicles, Wesker, all of those. The superego is the Stars Corporation, and the ego are the little bits and bobs everywhere, like the townspeople or Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. So I compared it to that at one point, I think in a video that I did for Psychologically Gaming, I believe. But yeah, it's really fascinating how everything just molds together and encompasses in this one unique thing that is called your brain. But you guys, that is it for today's episode of Psychologically Gaming. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you want, let me know down in the comments below if you think I should continue the Psych 101 lessons. I really find it fascinating to teach you guys the things that I learned in college, and it's just, I love psychology so much. If it weren't for all the politics and everything like that, I would probably be a psychologist right now. And I most likely would have gotten my master's in clinical psychology, because that was the area that I was more or less leaning towards when I was getting my degree, because I had started off getting actually a biology and English degree, and then I switched over during my second year and I have a degree in psychology and a triple minor in communications, fine arts, and philosophy. So it's a lot of stuff that I had to do in order to be able to get that degree, but I consider it worth it, and I'm able to share some of my wisdom and knowledge with you guys in things and places that we would have never thought this would even exist. So if you guys like my face and what I do, please be sure to subscribe and hit that bell down below, because I make videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And as usual, stay casually nerdy, and I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.